Okay, guys, I just want to welcome you to our class. We're going to be doing a combined digital and a overhead video class. So it's going to be in like 4 different sections. So first of all, I just wanted to go over that we are getting towards the end of our classes. We're going to have 2 more after this. So I've been handing out the notes for the classes in segments. And I know that people have some of them, people don't have some of them. Now would be a good time to just review what you do have and what you don't have. I'm just sort of scrolling through this lightly right now. But we're going to be focusing pretty much on composition today. So composition is parts of a whole. And technically, it's the term given to a complete work of art, and more specifically to the way in which all its elements work together to produce an overall effect. That sounds very general because when it says all its elements, that could mean anything. But we're going to try and divide that down into a few specific categories. But I will say that composition is often about large shapes and how those shapes look on the campus. So we'll go into this a little bit when we go into some examples. So terminology first is shape. What are the different sections of the piece made up of? So shape can be something that's very obvious. For example, this is a triangle. In this composition, this is a circle. But I would define sort of like these edges of the lines that are coming through as a line over here, and then this becomes a shape. So I would say that this has a line across it plus a shape of a circle. We could say that in this sort of composition, we have the chair, which is butted straight up against the wall. And then I would say that these little sockets are actually part of the composition and would be important. So these would be shapes that I would decide to use. Now, sometimes in composition, we simplify shapes. So rather than having a full bird shape, we might draw an oval for this bird and an oval for this bird. So now that we've sort of defined what a shape looks like, I often tell people that, like, for example, complicated shapes can be sort of approximated. So for example, this dog shape, while it has, many compound shapes, I could simplify this into a squarish rectangle of a sort, and I could sort of make this cat into a triangle. So that's sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about shapes. We're talking about areas of space that have subjects that can be simplified into basic shapes. All right, line. The path the viewer's eye follows. So the path that the viewer's eye follows is not always one that is very straightforward, and it often differs from person to person. So a lot of times I get asked the question, like, what if I saw this first or I saw that first? Does that change it? Not really. There are sort of some different ways of seeing, but I will say that there are strong decisions that most artists have made to help lead your eye around a composition. So, for example, there are some things that are less obvious and some things that are more obvious, but most of the ones that we're actually looking at are going to be like the use of doors, windows, triangles, circles, those sorts of basic things that are big elements of what the eye follows. Sometimes you'll find that the eye may follow a couple of items across the page. So for example, your eye may follow a couple of feathers in a composition that go diagonally down and across the picture plane. And that sort of composition is definitely legitimate. There's a lot of compositions in Japanese composition where it follows a lot of like watermarks or wave marks or even gold marks for clouds. So those sorts of elements can also be something that moves your eye around the composition. So we're going to also go over that a little bit more later. So is the composition balanced? So one of the first things that I think is pretty easy to do is to look at a composition and say, does it look static or chaotic? Or symmetrical or asymmetrical? So one of the things that we're talking about is visual balance. If you were to put the image on a scale, right, like this, This side with the dog is obviously heavier. This side with the cat is lighter. So this would have more of the picture plane than with the cat, right? Now they've moved the balance point up a little so we can sort of see it. Let's take a look at this one. This one's a really good example of something that we would call asymmetrical. And that means that the biggest subject in the composition is really isolated to this side of the composition. That being said, the line that these lights draw goes from the bottom and travels up to the center plane of the composition and leads our eye to this circle. Cool. Here's another example of a very asymmetrical composition. And in some ways, there's a little bit of balance to this because the light switches balance the chair. But it's really interesting to see that the chair is pretty much all on its own in this corner. And for some reason, there's an anticipation that you sort of feel looking at this and at the starkness of this that creates a composition, even though it's not very many items. Finally, then we have something like this, two birds, and it's a pretty much a mostly symmetrical composition. If both of these birds were made into ovals, we'd have two ovals that are sort of facing each other. Now, the red string adds a little bit of a line of direction or movement, which is sometimes, that's going to provide a little bit of variety for us so our composition doesn't look too static. So when we talk about things, we use the word static, which means that something looks grounded and stable. We'll review this again. And then something can also look symmetric or not, but grounded and stable is one type of thing, and then the other thing can be symmetrical. So if you're trying to define a composition, you can say asymmetrical, symmetrical, grounded, or not grounded, and we'll sort of rotate those terms in. Finally, the next sort of thing that we're looking at is rhythm. So like movement, all artwork has a unique rhythm. Rhythm is extremely strange as a way to describe something visual because we associate it with an auditory sense. So I often tell people that it's different than pattern, but it can be a repeating element. So let's talk about pattern. Pattern is something that's carried out across the page sometimes, often repetitively at the same interval or at a staggered interval. But repetition and rhythm can be created by an element that's repeated but has a directional sense to it. So for example, the clouds here are directionally moving back, as are the hay bales. And so this artist has used this rhythm or this movement of something going back into space to suggest the length of the man's task. It's really long. It's taken him forever. He's gone from here all the way to up front on the picture plane. And this repetition is through, not through a pattern element, but through a rhythmic element like a repeated form that's often being manipulated in space. Similarly, the subject is here and we can sense his exhaustion. So this sense of the endless that's going on behind him is a really good contrast to his expression and also his body pose, which look very tired. All right, let's take a look at another one. Here is another example of something that could resemble a pattern, but isn't really a pattern. So while these figures that are kind of hoisted into the background and that are placed look almost pattern-esque, they are irregular and they're not placed regularly, and they are also atmospherically placed as though they're going back into space. So that creates an image that isn't really based about pattern, it's based about dimension. So it's a repeated form. So these people create a rhythm which tells us the distance between this one and then the teeny ones in the back. All right. So often the idea of repetition in composition is used to make something stand out from what's normal and expected. So the best way to say this, we can say an anomaly, but that's not actually that's just what it is. That's not what the art term is. So something that deviates from the expected. So here we have a great example of what deviates from the expected. We have these mannequins that are placed without arms that are very stable, not moving, up and down, vertical. And they're repetitive, but they're contrasted to this real living figure that has her head tilted back. And a lot of the motion of her head, which deviates on the angles, kind of creating this composition where I'm sort of looking at them and then I'm getting caught up in her and I'm looking back. So I'm sort of looking at her at the end of the composition because that's the person that's different from the rest of the mannequins, and she's the focal point. Similarly, these are Andy Warhol. I don't necessarily love them. I'm just going to say that they exist. But I do think that it's pretty obvious that these ones that have less contrast seem to be different than this one that has the most contrast, which you could say could be the most quote-unquote realistic. But I think the idea is not to create really that much variety. Like, we're not supposed to look at these and think that they're all different. We're supposed to look at them and think that they're all relatively similar in the idea of them being an icon. But I do think that, you know, even within this composition, he did make a little bit of difference of choice in the values to make some of them pop out a little bit more than others, just so that way they weren't totally visually the same. So that's a compositional element as well. Movement. So a composition directs the eye of the viewer around the work. So actually, what I would do right here is pause for a second, take a minute, and the terms that we've gone over have been unity and variety, which is what we were just looking at, and rhythm and repetition, and then also symmetry and asymmetry. Since you guys have a magazine with you, what I would do is I would look around in that magazine, first 3 or 4 pages, and mark down things that are symmetrical, asymmetrical, and things that have elements of rhythm or repetition in a repeating form, like these guys. And I think it's really good to get used to visually identifying these, because the more that we identify them, the better we get at seeing them. Also look for something that might be an anomaly in a magazine or in a picture, something that really stands out or is different. And this will be done invariably in advertisements as a way to suggest that you can stand out from the crowd. So I would take a second and do that. Go ahead and take about 5 minutes, and I'm going to just jump in at the next video, and then we'll stop from there, okay? So at this point, we're just identifying forms that have visual symmetry, asymmetry, rhythm, repetition, and that have maybe an anomaly or something that looks different than the rest of them. Great.